So where are lowest prices just the beginning? Bunnings Warehouse, you know that. Okay, so where am I going to eat fresh? Subway. So down, prices are down at? Coles. But if I want to go to the fresh food people? Woolworths. What about if, don't hold back, I bought a Jeep? Of course I bought a Jeep. What about, which is the Yes Bank? Commonwealth? Okay, a bit tricky. I'm loving it where? McDonald's. Of course I'm loving it at McDonald's. So what about any other slogans you can think of? The burgers are better at? Hungry Jacks. Of course they're better at Hungry Jacks. How do you know all this? Who taught you this stuff? And you know that stuff and lots more. We could go on and all this stuff is in your head that you just know somehow. So tonight we're going to talk about advertising. Has it got anything to do with your faith? Has it got anything to do with your relationship with Christ and how that grows? Has it got anything to do with what you're living for? And when we sing songs like Christ is Enough, and when we sing songs about all of us, all I need is in Him, then how might advertising be playing some other games in our head? Reality is you're going to live in, you don't have to live in consumer culture. We could go and start a little commune at Nimbin. And if you're from Nimbin, hey, that's great. But we could do that, but that's not the reality of what Christ calls us to either. He calls us to be in the world. He calls us to be salt. He calls us to be light. He calls us to make an impact. And reality is you and I live in consumer culture. Reality is we're going to get fed thousands of messages. And reality is it will be a space where we're going to be immersed in consumer culture, but we can look at it through different eyes. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But first of all, I noticed a couple of you are here that weren't here last night. So if anyone can help the last night people, by coming up, and if you can tell me the materialistic value orientation grid. We did an equation last night where something equaled something equaled something equaled something. Then I have a prize for you. The prize is a new book, Melbourne University Press by Anne Mann, The Life of I. Now, the real cool thing about this book, I don't know if you can see it from there, but in the front, it's me, but now it's you. So you see yourself in the cover, which is very clever, but it's all about the new culture of narcissism. In a world of me, what happened to us is her question. So she writes about how consumer culture has commodified us. We commodify one another. We turn each other into a product, in a commodity, that we make me the center and you exist to make me happy and serve me. So she's writing about the implications of that in our culture. If you would like this book, and if you were here last night, and if you can tell me this equals this equals this equals this. Can anyone give that a try? Does anyone want the book?
I can do it.
Well, come and do it. However that was. I can't see you, but if you want to come up here and do it. And what's your name?
Tammy.
Tammy, I met you last night, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Okay, so come over this side. Something. Time equals.
Money.
Equals.
Things.
Equals.
Happiness.
Time equals money equals things equals. There's a lovely book for you. And you're on the cover. Tim Casser says that's just the grid we live by. We grow up, 98% of us, he says, think this way. George Barner says 96% of Christians think this way. We think that time equals money equals things equals happiness. We think that the goal of life is happiness. We think that the best way to achieve happiness is through products and experiences. We think we're going to get those products and experiences through money. And we think that time generates money, so then whatever takes my time takes my happiness. And that's why we're a society where we don't invest into other people, because that takes my time. Dangerously, we don't invest into relationships with one another because it takes my time, and that includes a relationship with God. Because a relationship with God takes time. And time is something that rush, busy consumer people don't have. Or time is something that we don't invest in relationship with God, because a relationship with God isn't something that seems to have immediate social media impact. I don't just say I had a relationship with God and that doesn't look cool. But when it comes to the crunch, that's the stuff that matters. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So, Reality is, if you live in a Western consumer culture city, which is, if you live in Melbourne, that's one of them, you're going to be given 3,000 messages a day, according to a whole lot of research. 3,000 messages a day from the back of buses, from billboards, from your internet screen, from the newspapers, from your television, from your radio. 3,000 messages a day that tell you you need something more. Last night we talked about our addiction to more, how we need newer and faster and bigger and better. Just over behind Mal's tent, that's where my little Jayco Swan caravan camper trailer thing, half a caravan folds out into a tent type deal, is set up over there. Now, last week, it's 10 years old, and I'm dragging it around with my 10-year-old Ford Territory, and I was just thinking the other day, if this was 10 years ago, I'd probably feel pretty rich at the moment because I have a new Territory, new caravan, but it's 10 years later, so it's a 10-year-old Territory and a 10-year-old caravan. But I was feeling pretty special about this. Because when I was growing up and I used to go to Adelaide big camp, I was always staying in tents, and wow, I'm staying in a caravan, that's pretty cool. And yesterday I'm setting it up, not having much of a clue what I'm doing, because last night was the first night that my wife and kids and I all slept in our new little camper trailer thing, and we looked at Moy's one, and she'd set hers up beautifully, and hers is just probably a couple of models later than mine, but that's okay, because I can be a couple of models behind Moy. And she's a bit more up to date than I am, and a little bit cooler than I am, but that's okay. But I was getting some ideas. But then this morning I had to go down and talk at the Meridian spot down the other end. So I'm walking down there, and as I'm walking, I'm seeing some bigger caravans. And there's some people who have some huge hulking caravans with air conditioners on top and toilets inside, and they've got beautiful big awnings out the side. And there's one with a satellite dish over there. I don't know if they want to watch some sort of Dwight Nelson satellite program tonight or what, but they've got a satellite dish on top of their caravan. And I'm thinking my caravan's not so cool at all. In fact, I'm walking along down to the tent getting more and more depressed, thinking, they must be really happy in that big hulking van. They've got alloy wheels on their van. Their van's better than my little van. And it was only a few days ago I thought my van was pretty cool. But I'm all of a sudden seeing these wonderful, big, beautiful vans, and someone's got a great big Winnebago motorhome down there, and they're towing a little car behind it even. And they're thinking, they must be really happy. They must be the happiest person on the campground because they've just won the game of Winnebagos and caravans, in my opinion. That they've got the best one and the biggest one. Now, if that's yours, that's great. And if God's blessed you with a Winnebago with a little thing to carry on behind you, that's beautiful. But here's our problem. I end up with caravan envy. And I end up with my little caravan. I come back to it, and I'm not the happiest person on the campground anymore because it's all the big ones down there. But they'll look across the tents and thinking, whoo, I'm just a little bit better than the tents. But we do this with all of our life. We just compare and get messages and think, if I had that, then I would be happier. The problem is we're always a step away. It's always just out there. If I had that one. In fact, now I've got that one. What about if I had this one? Oh, but now I need that one. And the problem is when we play this game, when we play this I am what I own game, and Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. He says your self-worth is not your net worth, is how Jesus explains it. But when we start playing this game, we end up in some weird spots. Now, like I said last night, the fact you've got stuff, that isn't the biggest problem. In fact, people who have a lot of material goods and score very low on consumerism, if they've got their head around the fact that their self-worth is not tied up in their net worth, if they've got their head around the fact that absolutely everything is from God and for His glory, Colossians 1:16, if they've got their head around the fact that sure, God might bless them with material things, but that doesn't make them a better person than someone else who doesn't have those things, if they've got their head around the fact that everything God has blessed them with is still His and for the blessing of others, or there might be someone with relatively little but might score high on consumerism because they've invested their hopes and desires in thinking, I need all that. This is the danger. The danger is our hope and desire gets transferred from being in Christ, like we just sung about, all my hopes are in you, it gets transferred from there to things. Desire gets transferred from those transcendent things. My desire for heaven, that space that we do have a space where we realize that we're not complete at the moment. We do have a space where we realize that there's something wrong inside at the moment. And that desire is meant to be there because we're a long way from what God created us to be. The oneness that we're meant to experience in connection with God, the whole sin problem puts a gap in that. But rather than that being filled by a desire for heaven, desire gets transferred into things. And pretty soon we end up chasing things, and hope and desire gets put in temporal things rather than the transcendent things that matter. That's when it gets dangerous. And here's the thing with advertising. Advertising spends its time trying to tell you that when you sing Christ is enough for you, then at least 1,000, as I say, some researchers are saying 3,000, but at least 1,000 times a day, you're going to get told, well, no, Christ is not enough for you. It's Christ and whatever product you need in your skin. It's Christ and whatever you need to put in, you'll make your hair work properly. It's Christ and whatever you need to be driving because that's a cooler car than that. It's Christ. Now, there's nothing wrong with these things, by the way. But it is a problem when we start looking at those things and relate them to our worth. It is a problem when those things crowd out what matters most. So hope and desire get transferred, and we get that message all the time, that we need something more. Jesus tells a story in Luke 12. He tells a parable, and the parable's called in our Bibles, often it gets called the rich fool. But he starts off, and a guy says to him, tell my brother to share the inheritance. And Jesus says to him, says to this guy, be on your guard against greed, which is a strange answer because Jesus doesn't say anything about the inheritance. He just says, be on your guard against greed. He says, life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. He says, greed has a way of taking hold of you. Greed has a way of sneaking up on you. Greed has a way of making your heart more calloused. And reality is, you probably at some time need to look at yourself and say, am I a more generous person now than I was 6 months ago? Or has greed got a way of taking hold of my heart? And Jesus says to him, your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. Your self-worth is not your net worth. Reality is we start thinking that we are what we own. We do what we call commodify, and that's the word I want us to remember tonight, this whole commodification idea. What's a commodification? Commodification is when I take a product or a person or experience and I look at them to the value of what they can contribute to me. I turn people and things into a commodity. Something that I can use. I make myself the center and everything else is a commodity. Now, this happens in a lot of different ways. Tim Kasser, the guy who wrote the book High Price of Materialism, says right from the age of 7 is where he did his research. He says children have the ability to commodify. They've already learnt that trick. He says advertising teaches them that trick. Advertising teaches them to filter a message and think, how does that product or experience or even person contribute to my happiness? Craig Bartholomew has written an excellent essay where he writes about how we commodify Scripture. And we look at Scripture, we take little bits of it, we turn it into a commodity that is useful for me. And rather than I being transformed by the Word, I turn the Word into what I want. Or, as Sky Jathani in his book With says, we turn God into a commodity, where God's job is to make me happy. And God becomes a dispenser of product and service to make me happy. We turn worship into a commodity, where all of a sudden worship is all about me and how I feel about this. I turn church into a commodity, where church becomes a dispenser of religious services, and I take it and leave it. And I treat church as a commodity where I'm like, oh, well, that one's not in there. Now, sure, there's a place where you work out which community you're going to invest your life into. But consumerism teaches me to treat church as a commodity. And I look at that as an experience for me, where church is meant to be a community I get involved in serving in. Church is a place where I have deep relationships with. That can be messy sometimes, but rather as commodity, we look at it and go, it didn't meet my needs. And so I'm going to go here. And I go over here because there's some really cool speaker there. Oh, no, I'm going to go over there. And so I go around all over the place. Here a church, there a church, everywhere a church. And I just use church as commodity. I don't get involved. I don't serve and use my gifts. I don't get involved in community and deep relationships. I just do this surface consuming thing. Or I consume worship. And worship becomes how I feel. It's about me. There was a story in a magazine, a leadership magazine, about a guy who was filling in as pastor of a congregation while a pastor was unwell. And this pastor writes a story of he was standing there shaking hands as people left. And this person comes up and shakes hands and says, I didn't like those songs we sung today. And the pastor replied, luckily we weren't singing them to you. And reality is, sometimes we sit there, didn't like that, don't like that song, didn't like that one. And we forget that it's not, that's me consuming worship. Rather than being in a space where as community we worship God, and sometimes that style may be in a way that's not my natural way that I want it to be, but together we worship God. Because otherwise we can easily end up consuming God, consuming church, consuming one another. So let's take this 7-year-old. So if this 7-year-old has this process of commodification sorted out, as Tim Cassis says he does, what does he know? He knows that life is about his happiness. He's been taught that from early on. Right back at the start, people say to parents, what's your goal for this child? I just want him to be happy. And so he knows the goal is happiness. That's the goal of life. He knows that things are what deliver happiness. He's been taught right from little that there's always a product to match the experience. He's been taught that happiness comes in things. If you're still not happy, we'll buy a Happy Meal. He knows that happiness comes in things. He knows that things are for his use and to make him happy. He knows that life is disposable. We live in what we call disposable society, where we don't have to hang on to things so much anymore. It's meant to be disposable. Those little toys he gets in his Happy Meal, where do they end up? They're in the car a few weeks later, and mum and dad are cleaning out the car, and there's the chips and there's the toys. It's a disposable society. You don't have to hang on to it. Now, even if you do have something you hang on to, you know that there's an update coming. You know that if you've got your Nintendo Game Boy, you know that that's out of date because now you've got to have a Nintendo DS, and that's out of date because you've got to have the DSi, and that's out of date because you've got to have the DSi 3D, that's out of date because you've got to have the DSi 3D XL. How do I know this? Because I've got 3 boys. And one of my boys comes to me, and I sit there and talk to my boys about consumer culture, and we analyse advertising and talk about what these advertisers are trying to do to your brain and how they're trying to get you to buy their product and how they tell you it's going to make you happy, but it's not really. You're going to be back where you were just before you started. I talk about all this stuff with my kids. And one of my boys comes to me and says, Dad, consumer power's got to me. I really do need the 3DDS XL. And so we talked about, do you really need it? And yeah, he went and bought it. And reality is, right from here, they're taught there's an upgrade coming. They're taught instant gratification. You can have it now. They see mum and dad buying it interest-free terms. Don't worry about saving up. You can have it now. They get taught it's all about my story. Commodification teaches me it's about my story. It's not about engaging in some other big story. Everyone else exists for my story. I'm not interested in your story. It's about me. That's what commodification does. So that's what's happened to here's Johnny, our 7-year-old, and he already knows it's instant gratification. He already knows it's about his happiness. He already knows that you exist for how you contribute to his story. He already knows that it's a disposable society. Okay, so Johnny grows up, and now Johnny will make him 16. Okay, so Johnny notices girls, What's a girl exist for in Johnny's world? Exists for me. This girl is a commodity to make me happy. And if she's not making me happy, that misses the point. This girl exists for my story. I actually don't care about her story. I don't mind about her parents and all that sort of stuff. No, she exists for my story. Instant gratification. Don't wait for this delayed gratification stuff. We have it now, and her job is to make me happy. She's disposable. I use her for my happiness now, but it's not about some long-term thing, because that can all be messy and everything. It's disposable. Now, even if I do commit to her, there's an upgrade coming. There's going to be a better version of this down the track. They're going to update and upgrade this thing. And so don't be too committed to it, because you've got to be ready to get out of this so I can get that one, because there's always a better one. And reality is, have I oversimplified? Yes. But does that story get played out on the streets of Melbourne night after night after night? Yes. And as that book I just gave away, The Life of I, talks about boys commodify girls and girls commodify boys, and we all turn each other into commodity, and commodity exists for me. And I can say I love you, but I actually love you for what you can do for me, which means I actually love me, and I just love that you love me. And enough about talking about me. What do you think of me? And so we live in this world where we turn people into commodity, and it's a dangerous thing to do. When we make someone else something that I can use. And sadly, people get hurt in this process. People get destroyed in this process, because it comes about what I want and what I will do. Advertising teaches me day after day, message after message, that I need something more. In the story in Luke chapter 12, where Jesus says, be on your guard against greed, your self-worth is not your net worth. He then tells a story. He says there was a man who had a very rich crop. So was consumerism around in Jesus' time? Well, selfishness was. And as I said last night, consumerism is just the institutionalized expression of selfishness. A very large crop. And he says, a man who already was a rich man, so he's already doing really well, and now he has a very large crop, so now he has an abundance of abundance. And the question he should ask himself is, why do I have so much? It's a question you and I probably should ask ourselves from time to time as well. Why do I have so much? Now, you might think you don't have much, and sure, pray to bring everything to God in prayer, but maybe a prayer that some of you need to pray, and a whole lot of us need to pray in our culture is, God, why have you given me so much? He answers that question by saying, it must be for me. So what will I do with all my things? I'm going to build bigger barns. I'm going to tear down my old ones, and I'm going to build bigger ones. Now, this guy was successful. There's nothing wrong with being successful. Just remember, being successful and being significant are two very different things. And you might be successful by this world's standards, and that's great. But significance is a very different thing. And tomorrow we're going to talk about what a story of significance is. But this guy was successful. He was winning. We would look at this guy and go, he's doing really well. He's winning the game by this standard. So here he is with his bigger and bigger barns. And he's got a plan. If you read the plan in Luke 16, his plan is, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. I've stored up all these things in my barns for me. He's forgotten that the very fact that his wheat grew is God's blessing, and the very fact the rains come is God's blessing. He's forgotten that everything, absolutely everything, belongs to God. He thinks it belongs to me. And I've stored up all my treasures. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. This man is in control of everything, it seems, except his heartbeat. Because it says that night he died. Now, death is a problem for consumerism. Death is a very inconvenient truth for consumerism. This is partly why in advertising, who do we worship? In advertising, we worship celebrity. In advertising, we worship 25-year-olds. In advertising, we worship some of you. Because at this age, consumerism, it seems like life goes on, that's when you're at your greatest consumer potential. And so we avoid this part of life. We don't want to see this part of life because the little lady on her walking frame, it doesn't engender so much joy about consumerism. And at this part of life, we start realizing how hollow life can be. At this part of life is where we get reflective about thinking about what we gave our life to. Back at this part of life, we don't have to think that stuff. We can just eat, drink, and be merry because we're in control. And so in advertising, we glorify this age group. And we try really hard to turn these ones into this, and this is why you can buy stilettos and push-up bras for 7-year-olds. And we want to turn them into 25-year-olds. Now, once someone goes past the 25, 30-year-old thing, well, with females, we give them all sorts of insecurities, and we give them all sorts of products and operations that put things back where gravity took them away from. And we say, look like a 25-year-old again, and 40's the new 20, and 50's the new 20, and now 60's the new 20. We don't want to grow up because we want to stay back here because this is where consumerism feels right. And as we get down here, consumerism starts being a bit of a worry. And as we get to this part, oh no, this is a problem. Because we've given our life to this grid where I want all this stuff, and here we end up sitting in our old age home with big, huge bank accounts and very empty hearts. We've won the game, but we start realizing we've won the wrong game. We've actually given our life to something that didn't matter. And so back at this point, that's why we celebrate this, and that's why we avoid death. Mark Sayers, who writes some very clever stuff, wrote a book called The Trouble with Paris. And in that he talks about how he says there was a time when we were a sex-repressed society during the Victorian era, and apparently that's when they used to cover up the legs on their pianos because that was somehow seen as sexual. And I never quite get the piano leg thing, but we were a sex-repressed society. And if you wanted to be on the edge of society, you celebrated that by sexual deviance. He says now sex is everywhere, that you can walk into your petrol station and while you're waiting to pay for your petrol, there's all these magazines putting sex everywhere. But he says we're now a death-repressed society. He says we avoid death. He said back in that Victorian era, death was everywhere. You get a plague or whatever and death was in your face. He said now we want to avoid death. He says if you want to be on the edge of society now, you get into death metal and gothic type things that celebrate death because he said we want to be death repressed because we want to make out we're not going to die. Because the death is going to simply point out the hollowness of the consumer grid. Death is going to point out that this endless chase for what's just out there, this I'm going to get the next thing, I'm going to get the next thing, starts becoming very hollow. So in our story, Jesus says, He died. Which is Jesus' way of saying, think about what you're giving your life to. I think if Jesus told the story today, he would talk about someone who was doing really well, someone who did just great in uni and came out and got the good job and was winning and business was going well and all the graphs were going up. He was successful. He ended up marrying the beautiful girl and had the lovely kids in the big house in the good suburb. Everything was going great. However, this man has a heart attack. But he didn't die. But he just thought to himself, well, I'm going to have to do life differently. I'm probably not going to work as hard. He was off to work very early and home very late. There's nothing wrong with off to work early and home late, as long as that doesn't turn into weeks and months and years, as long as that's not at the expense of healthy marriage and parenting, relationship with God, as long as that's not at the expense of involvement in your church and being part of community. But he's doing really well. He's successful. People look at him and go, he's an entrepreneur. He's successful. He's ahead of the times. He's got a wife at home who had dreams for an intimate marriage, and she knows that's not going to happen anymore. He has kids at home. They know they're second fiddle to this briefcase that comes home every night with extra work in it. And as he misses their soccer games, they know where they fit on the priorities. His wife says, come up to bed, honey. I've just got to get some KPI sorted out for tomorrow. And it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and she comes down to where he's slumped over his computer like a little kid. She grabs his shoulder, but it's cold and clammy. He'd died a few hours before. At his funeral, people said some very good things. People said, this guy was successful. This guy was an entrepreneur. This guy was clever. This guy was ahead of the times. This guy was a winner. This guy was successful is the word that he gave his life to. But if you read our parable in Luke 12, What's the word that Jesus uses for this man? He says, "You fool. You fool." This man wasn't a bad man. This man wasn't a man running around doing terrible things in society and being destructive. He was just a fool. A very rich, successful, doing great fool. Why? You're a fool. Why? Because you gave your life to things that didn't matter. You spent your life and you invested your life into now. Now, there's lots of rich people in the Bible who Jesus doesn't call fool. So that's not the problem. Where the problem is the attitude this guy had, where why do I have so much? It must be for me. So Jesus says, here's the answer. He says, be rich toward God is what he says. He says, live a life that is being rich toward God. And then he explains what rich to God is. He says, seek out his kingdom. Reality is there's another kingdom going on. We're going to talk about that tomorrow when we talk about the stories that we live out in this kingdom story. He says there's another kingdom with a whole different set of priorities, where rather than be served, you serve. Rather than it's about me, it's about one another. He says, seek his kingdom. He says, give to the poor. He says, store treasure in heaven. What's treasure in heaven? Treasure in heaven is investing your life into people now. In a society, in consumer society, where as consumerism goes up, community and connectedness goes down, treasure in heaven is investing your life into relationships. People are the treasure of heaven. The very people who are sitting beside you now, they are the treasure of heaven. That's where you invest your life in heaven's economy. Just out of curiosity, what's gold in heaven? It's just pavers. Reality is people are the treasure, and sadly, consumerism teaches me to turn people into commodity. When I turn people into commodity, that's the exact opposite to what Jesus says, where he says, invest your life into people, into relationships. Jesus says, following his parable, he says, plan to be involved in serving, serve one another. Jesus says, he says, plan to be generous. Generosity defeats consumerism, because in consumerism, it's about me and what I accumulate. In this kingdom culture, in this different story, in this story we'll explore tomorrow, it's about being generous. It's about investing into someone else's story. And rather than it being about me, it becomes about one another and others, which is what Jesus talks about all the time. When he's saying love one another, serve one another, pray for one another, it becomes about this one another's. That's a different story. So, give yourself a heart check and think, am I a more generous person now than I was 6 months ago, 12 months ago? If people were asked to describe me, would the word generous be amongst their list? Would people describe me as a generous person? Am I going to invest my life into people? In reality, you're going to have an opportunity to do that in that cafe this evening, where you're going to have an opportunity to be generous and invest your life into people that you might not lock eyes with them, but you're making a difference for people. You have an opportunity to fight against the consumerism that says it must be for me and I need to look after my things for me. If Christ really is enough, then maybe we're going to live out his priorities. And we plan now to be generous. Now, there's other things we're going to talk about over the next few days. And tomorrow we're going to talk about these different stories we lay out. And we're going to talk about consumerism and the impact on the environment and how as Christians we have a responsibility for that. And a whole lot more things to talk about. But for tonight, I want you to think about commodity versus generosity. And are you a person who invests your life into others? When we say Christ is enough, when we sing songs about Christ being a cornerstone, when we sing songs about our hope being built on nothing less, when we sing songs about our foundation of life being in Christ, when we sing songs about Christ being my hope and dreams, what would it look like if that were true? What if that was what we pursued? What if Christ was enough? And as he worked in and through us, that was our story. And what if our desire was in living out that story and being that kingdom revolution? The kingdom community is the revolution our society needs. It is the opposite to consumerism. What if we're invested in being that revolution? And sure, you're going to consume, sure, you're going to buy clothes and buy houses and buy cars, but you're going to do it with different glasses on. You're going to do it not being about you, but everything, absolutely everything belongs to him. And whether he's given you lots or whether he's given you little is not the point, because he is enough. He is your cornerstone. In him you find your meaning, significance. And over the next few days, we're going to talk a little more about what that means. As you sing this song tonight, this combination of songs, talking about different aspects of how Christ works in and through us, think about what that looks like lived out in your life. Dear Lord, as we sing about all our hopes being in you and you being the foundation of our lives and no other hope for us, we just pray that that becomes an increasing reality in our life, and in a world that clamours for our attention in all sorts of ways, when we get all sorts of messages asking us to put our hope somewhere else, may we come back to that cornerstone, may we come back to that foundation, may we see with new eyes and look at a world differently, and may we not be consumed by this world. May we allow you to dwell richly in us, work in and through us now. Amen.